Our scripture this morning comes from the book of Genesis, chapter 32. We'll be reading verses 22 through 31. The same night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Here ends the reading. If you want to make it a personal quest to visit all of our national parks and monuments, the National Parks Service has a fun way to keep track of your progress. They have produced a National Parks passport. Now, of course, we don't need literal passports to visit our national parks. These are just keepsakes. They have maps and information about each park, as well as a space for you to get a stamp. So it shows that you have been there to these different parks and monuments. So Lindsay and I bought this one, and we had grand plans of filling it out. Like, we're going to go to every single one in the whole passport. But we kept leaving it at home. And so when you do that, they give you these little other pieces of paper that you can put the stamp on, but it's not quite the same thing. And so then we got smart, and we were like, okay, since we keep leaving this at home, we're gonna put it in the glove compartment, which was a brilliant plan until we took the other car. So there you have it. Nearly empty passport. If we had created a passport for our Holy Ground series on the national parks, it would be filled so far with 9 stamps, including today's, which, in case you're keeping track, represents a total journey of 20,829 miles so far. We have been around. We have been at the seashore, and we have been through the desert, and we've been up in the mountains. We've been above the Arctic Circle, even at the top of a volcano where we were last Sunday. But today, we have arrived at a completely different landscape. Today, we are underground. There are more than 4,700 caves within the national park system, but most of these caves are parts of other parks. In fact, there are only 3 cave systems, interesting enough and impressive enough to be their own national park. Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico, Wind Cave in South Dakota, and today's destination, Mammoth Cave in Kentucky. True to its name, Mammoth Cave is the largest known cave system in the entire world. There are more than 400 mapped miles of underground passages, as Kyle shared, but only about 12 miles are open to the public. Sites in the cave include Mammoth Dome, with a vaulted ceiling that soars 192 feet overhead. In other words, taller than a 17-story building. So imagine being underground in a dome taller than a 17-story building. And at the other end of the spectrum is a passage they affectionately call Fat Man's Misery. Do not blame me, blame the park rangers. This is a spot too narrow to fit through if you are more than 42 inches across. Having spent a fair amount of time in Carlsbad Caverns myself, and in some of Texas' cave systems, I was surprised to discover that Mammoth Cave is mostly a dry cave. I'm used to dripping sounds in the caves. There are the stalactite and stalagmite formations, but they are they're dead. They're not continuously being rebuilt, as in Carlsbad Caverns or in the cave systems I've been in Texas. So I'm used to that dripping sound, that drip, drip, drip of living stones. It's from the rainwater that seeps through the ground and eventually makes its way into the cave system and then drips from the ceiling, forming the stalactites that hang from the ceiling. As I learned in 3rd grade, if they hang on tight enough, they'll stay on the ceiling, and the stalagmites that might reach the ceiling as they rise up from the floor. Most of Mammoth Cave is not like that, the drip, drip, drip of living stones. Mammoth Cave is simply vast. But what everybody talks about from their visit at Mammoth Cave is the darkness. Kyle mentioned it in his moment of wonder, and Connor Knighton does too in his book, Leave Only Footprints. It is shockingly dark. Close your eyes, now cover them with your hand. It is darker than that. It is way darker than that, he says. It was only after all the lights had gone off that we were given a glimpse of what the early cave explorers would have seen: a pitch black nothingness. No signs, no marked passageways, no strategically lit columns. A flickering lamp might have barely illuminated the way ahead, but glance back in the other direction and there would be no trace of where you had been. You wouldn't see anything. Brad Lyons and Bruce Barkhauer talk about it too in their book, America's Holy Ground, our guide for this series. Despite the cave's rugged beauty and a human history of use that encompasses everything from mining salt and gypsum to serving as a hospital for tuberculosis patients, there is one amazing thing that stands over against all the others. It's darkness. Complete and utter darkness. Turn out the lights, extinguish your lantern flame, and you are at once plunged into it. Such total darkness, they say, is incredibly disorienting. This total absence of light creates instant anxiety. You are instantly and hopelessly lost. You can attempt to comprehend it, taking deep breaths, seeking to find a centering point in the moment. You have likely, they say, never experienced a blackness this deep. The rangers don't let you stay that way too long. But in that darkness, when you can focus on nothing in your surroundings, save the cool air and the silence of the space, something is different. The darkness isolates you from everything but yourself. Jacob knows this kind of isolation. On the banks of the River Jabbok, in total darkness, he is isolated from everything but himself. And it is a disorienting experience for him. Let's rewind the story a bit in case you're not familiar with it. You remember from our story a couple of weeks ago that Jacob tricked his brother Esau out of his birthright. But that wasn't the end of his dirty tricks. Later, when their father was on his deathbed, Jacob cheated Esau again. This time he took advantage of his father's blindness and pretended to be Esau so that he could get Isaac's one and only firstborn blessing. It is a heartbreaking scene when Esau discovers what has happened. Genesis chapter 27. When Esau heard it, he cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry and said to his father, "Bless me, me also, father." But Isaac said, "Your brother came deceitfully, and he has taken away your blessing. But father, have you not reserved a blessing for me?" I think that is one of the most heartbreaking sentences in the whole Bible. "But father, have you not reserved a blessing for me? Have you only one blessing? Bless me, me also, father." And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. Jacob was a dirty dealing snitch of a grabber. It is difficult for us to understand in our culture how there could only be one blessing. We don't understand family systems in that way. Well, of course I have more blessings to give to you, my son, but that's not the way they understood family systems back then. In that time and in that place, there was only one blessing to be shared with the firstborn, and Jacob stole it. The anger in Esau rises up, and all he wants to do is kill Jacob. That is a dark place. Coward that he is, Jacob runs away. The two men go their separate ways, and they live their separate lives. Years pass, and Jacob finally decides, you know what, maybe I should make amends. And so he sends a message to Esau seeking to reconcile. The only answer he gets from this message is a report that Esau is on his way with 400 men. Now imagine you're Jacob, and the last parting you had with Esau was he was ready to kill you, and now you have this report that he's coming with 400 men. What would you think? So Jacob panics. He divides his servants and his flocks and all of his household goods into two groups with the thought, okay, so if Esau attacks, he can only attack one group and then the other will get away. So at least I can maintain half of my property. He sends Esau an extravagant gift of hundreds of head of livestock just to kind of sweeten the pot a little bit. And then finally, in our passage today, Jacob sends his family across the river Jabbok to safety to get as much space between them and Esau as possible. Then, the text says, Jacob is left alone. Jacob is vulnerable and alone. He is alone with his thoughts. He is alone with his regrets. He is alone with his fears. It is a dark place to be. It is the darkest dark. It is pitch black nothingness. And there is Jacob, isolated and alone. Only he is not, because out of nowhere, a man tackles Jacob and wrestles him to the ground. For all Jacob knows, this is Esau coming to attack him to take his revenge. So Jacob is fighting as if his life is at stake, and it is, but not in the way that Jacob assumes. This wrestling match goes on all night long. So think about this. Does anybody here have any experience either wrestling or watching your kids wrestle? One. Yay! Not me. I had to look it up. So think about this. As I learned this week, wrestling matches last minutes. Even at the Olympic level, wrestling matches last minutes, with breaks in between. This wrestling match from Genesis that we read, this wrestling match on the banks of the river Jabbok lasted hours. Struggling, fighting, panting, aching, all night long. Think about how exhausted Jacob must have been. Are you exhausted? Have you been wrestling and struggling and fighting and aching? Has the darkness ever descended on you? A darkness that is the darkest dark. A pitch black nothingness. Have you ever felt isolated, vulnerable, and alone? I have been there. And it is okay for us to admit out loud that we have been there. Wrestling on the banks of our own river's Jabbok. Jacob's story is our story. We can relate to him, and we can learn from him. Why does God wrestle with Jacob so? For that is who this man is, as the story makes clear later on. It is not a man after all, but the very force of God that meets Jacob in this darkness. Why the wrestling? So, full disclosure, this line of thought makes me uncomfortable. I don't like to think about God like this, as testing me or intentionally bringing me to my knees. That's not how I understand God, and it's not how I have experienced God in my life. God sees me through the trials. God lifts me up from my knees. God does not come out of nowhere and pin me to the ground in a double-leg takedown. I had to look that up too. Of all the wrestling moves, that was my favorite name. So how can I reconcile what I believe and what I have experienced in my own life with this story? Because God is very clearly coming out of nowhere, pinning Jacob to the ground and wrestling with him. This is what I think is going on. Circumstances have brought Jacob to his knees. Circumstances have tested him. All of his mistakes have caught up to him here. All of his sins, all of his doubt, all of his insecurities, all of his brokenness have met him here in the darkness on the banks of the river Jabbok. Here in this moment, Jacob has to come face to face with all of it. When it is just you in the dark with no distractions and no escape, you have to come face to face with all that you are. And it can sometimes be a mighty wrestling match. What God is doing here, I think, is making Jacob face it. Jacob has spent his whole life running away from things, but not anymore. He has to face it right here. Jacob, who has never done the hard work of acknowledging his brokenness. Jacob, who has always been a grabber and a taker and a cheater and a liar, he has to wrestle with that. God wrestles with Jacob here and will not let him go until Jacob deals with all of it. On the banks of this river, in the darkness, Jacob is fighting for life. He is fighting for new life. And he gets it. As morning comes, God says, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." But Jacob replies, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Jacob stays in the struggle until he gets a blessing, and that is a lesson for us, to stay in the struggle until we get a blessing, to fight for it, to fight for this life that is ours, this new life that is promised to us. He stays in that struggle until he transforms. From the grasping, grabbing Jacob, remember the name Jacob means grabber, from the grasping, grabbing Jacob into Israel, a name that we're told in this story means striving, reaching. Jacob stays in the struggle until he becomes fully known to himself. And that is when he receives the blessing of God's hard truth and ridiculous grace. That is when he becomes fully known.